Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists that we have today. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's a senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs at the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Nia Johnson, who's a visiting assistant professor at Duke School of Law. Guys, it's good having you here with us and looking forward for our conversation today. Andrew Thorburn, who's a former banker, had been appointed to a key position in the Essendon football club, which many of us call soccer across the world. But it turned out that a little bit after he was put in place, he was forced to resign from this prominent club because of his connection to a conservative Melbourne church. You know, we talk a lot about the fact that religious freedom is very different in other parts of the world, but then we think in the United States that there are certain issues that would not exist, but in a global environment, what's happening in somebody else's backyard could easily show up in your backyard. Thorburn went forward and summed up his situation, and he said, "My personal Christian faith," he said, "is not tolerated or permitted in the public square, and as president of this Australian football club, the club disagreed with his stance and literally had him removed from his position." You know, Bettina, when I think about what's going on here, as somebody who loves sports, but really can't connect directly to what happened in Australia, I sense that maybe you might be able to correct a little bit different than I would. When you hear about something like this, one, are you surprised? And if you're not surprised, where do we see the future of things going forward with something along these lines?
Okay, Orland, let me give you the context here, because there's a few things that we need to understand to really get a sense of what's going on here. And the first thing is that sport is religion in Australia. I mean, Australia is basically a post-religious country. We have very low rates of religious participation. So sports are what help us sort of form a national identity. And they're very important in Australian culture. Okay, second, Australia, and this is shocking to many people, it has a very undeveloped legal discourse around religious freedom. It is the only nation, only Western liberal democracy that does not have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights that codifies respect for religious freedom. There's no constitutional prohibition in Australia that would prevent a state, for instance, from either advancing or inhibiting religion. And so we do not have that sort of legal culture that we have here in the US that allows for a robust discussion of what it means to accommodate different religious viewpoints in a pluralistic society. That's two things. The third is probably the most important, and that is that in Australia, there is an incredibly strong hostility to any public expression of a traditional biblical view of human sexuality. I mean, I joke with my husband when we visit Australia, reading the Sydney Morning Herald, which was probably one of the largest national dailies, it makes the New York Times look like it's a subsidiary of Fox News. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of vilification of conservative Christianity in the public space in Australia. So, you know, you asked if I was surprised at what happened to Mr. Thorburn. No, absolutely not. I'm not surprised at all.
You know, and Orland, I appreciate Bettina's reference to the media, because really this was an issue of the media pointing out the quote unquote inconsistent beliefs of the football club and the church that Mr. Thorburn had a leadership position in as well. And, you know, it was not, again, going through the conversation, an issue of inappropriate behavior, inappropriate statements being made by the individual. It was, again, just that he held a leadership role in a church where he held as a biblical view of marriage, or where that congregation held a biblical view of marriage. So I love where the story ended up. right? That they issued a joint statement and that they said, Mr. Thorburn and the football club, and they said, we went about this all wrong. This is not, we always, first of all, he's always been respectful in his dialogue with people of different views and perspectives. He is a person of integrity who treats others well, whether in the workplace or anywhere else. And so, we messed up here is what Essendon said. And I really appreciate that they publicly took that stance. I think there might have been some motivation with the possibility of a lawsuit. But I'm nevertheless glad to see where things ended up, because, we need to, again, we have such a diversity of perspectives. We're talking to here about, marriage and sexuality, but there are so many disparate perspectives that we need to, if we don't celebrate, that we at least are respectful of the individuals and their right to hold those opinions or those beliefs.
Well, Lawrence, I got to tell you, I wasn't surprised when Bettina said that sports is religion in Australia, because I think sports is religion in the United States of America. And the idea that anyone would even care
football on Sunday
about ownership or even who a player may be, as long as winning is taking place, I couldn't even imagine that anybody would even look at anything like this and even bring it up in any way, which made me wonder, was this a losing team or maybe not a losing team, which might more had to do with this than anyone's religious beliefs?
Speaking of losing teams, wait until you hear my tell me something I don't know. But as it relates to what we're talking about here, I, like Melissa, am greatly encouraged, because let's face it, in the absence of a My Pillow guy whole charade where you're actively espousing things that have clearly been debunked and you are, just wrapping yourself up in all that, absent something like that, when someone is able to clearly keep the different areas of their lives moving forward and operating respectfully, and I like that word respectfully. I'm very troubled by the lack of respect that I see developing in this country. It's very troubling. When you have someone who's able to do that, he should not have been so roughly treated, especially since, there was no reason to do that. And like Melissa, I too am very encouraged that things ended up the way they did.
So Nia, they ended up getting this conversation, and really the description was, are we going to be basically chastising people's religious beliefs in the public square? And I think sports is probably about as much a public square as you can find. And I think that we also realize that we're starting to see a tighter hold on people who are allowing their religious beliefs to be shown, where most people would say, don't allow your religious beliefs to be on display under any circumstances. When you look at this particular case, and in particular as you start seeing a younger generation of legal minds being developed, is this a nuance that actually comes into conversation in any way?
Well, I think it's really important that we differentiate that this is what happened in Australia and did not happen in the US. So given that, I spend time teaching students about US law, there isn't a one-to-one. But what I do think is really important here, and this is something that my students bring up quite a bit, is that, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer here, but, this particular coach did, put forward views that could be viewed by some to be inflammatory. He did compare abortions to the Holocaust, which is a very, very broad statement to make. And so as much as we, I do not think it was right that this individual was fired for his religious beliefs, because we would not want somebody to be fired, let's say, if they were, Muslim or wore hijab. I think it's also really important that, when we think about Christianity on the whole and conservative Christianity specifically, Christianity on the whole, as we think about, our role in society, that we have to be a little bit more mindful and not cautious, but think deeply about, can our speech be used, something that we think that is for evangelism and bringing people into something wholesome, be also used for nefarious means. We live in an era where people take these type of sound bites and use them to, fulfill incel thoughts and ideas that have led to other sorts of violence. We have, unfortunately, a history of even things like domestic violence being associated with religiosity in Christian spaces. And so as much as we look at things that we're like, yes, this is absolutely wholesome and this individual individuals should be allowed to hold their beliefs, which I absolutely believe in, that as we put forth things on the pulpit, which can be seen in the public square now, I do think we need to take a greater responsibility for the dialogues we may be contributing to, and both should go hand in hand.
So, Bettina, let me ask you this from a Melbourne perspective, because we see so many things that are different. You know, what a coach in New York says as opposed to a coach in Washington, as opposed to a coach in Cincinnati, may all be treated very differently. As it relates to Melbourne in particular in Australia, when you think about that dynamic and you juxtapose that in this story, is there anything that comes into play from that perspective at all?
Well, as Nia said, I mean, Australia is not the US. You can't compare the two. It's very different. But what I see in this story from Australia is perhaps sort of a warning that we really do need to be intentional here in the US before we start heading down the road that Australia has taken. We need to be intentional in developing a public space where we value a diversity of opinions. Because if we're trying to impose an orthodoxy, whether it's a religious orthodoxy, whether it's a philosophical or political orthodoxy, or even a view of human sexuality, if we're trying to impose just one view, then that's an authoritarian state. So all of us, Christians, non-Christians, people who hold different views on human sexuality, we all need to come together and work on building an inclusive and respectful public space. And I think we can do it, but we need to put in the work.
You know, Orlin, I was reading a opinion piece in The Guardian on this particular case. And I think that was what I was most troubled by. Again, not so much the actions of the private organization or the individual, but just how much society and particularly the media influenced the whole situation, or maybe even instigated. But in this opinion piece that I was reading, it was talking about why it was appropriate for things to happen in the way that they did, meaning the individual resigning from his position because of the outcry. And just a little quote from there, it says, "This was not an active exclusion of people of faith whose beliefs may be unfashionable and hurtful, but are sincerely held, but from a full participation in society, because the public square is now dominated by, quote, rabid insistence on conformity with progressive values and any divergence." And so what he says is not that's not what's happening here, the opinion writer said, but he said instead it's because the particular beliefs that Mr. Thorburn stands for are in themselves, by definition, intolerant. And to me, that's where I'm finding trouble, because again, beliefs, we're talking about an individual's own sincerely held religious beliefs, not their actions, not their, evangelism of these beliefs, simply just their beliefs.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, Melissa, but it's right on point. When we start to get to a point where somebody's beliefs are viewed to be intolerable simply because they're not incongruent with maybe what society may be thinking about, or something that you are comfortable with, we can't just decide we want to throw everything out just simply because somebody's not feeling good about it. The Supreme Court of the United States found themselves having to consider whether or not the Establishment Clause should be used in a way where you are barring a government-sponsored display of a 40-foot cross that's actually known as the Bladensburg Cross. This activity was taking place in Prince George's County, Maryland, and it turned out that there was this war memorial from World War I. It was put in place. It was in one of the port cities of Maryland, which is called Bladensburg, and the United States Court for the Fourth Circuit was applying a well-known, well-looking at three-part test, which was the Lemon Test. And after looking at the Lemon Test, they initially were trying to come to a conclusion of whether or not government funds should be used to continue to support this particular cross. Ironically, I have found myself driving past that cross before, and just is a little bit strange to just be in the neighborhood and all of a sudden you see this huge 40-foot cross there. But the case in turn ended up bringing some stark different points of view. Individuals were divided on where we should be going from a funding perspective. But then when you also juxtapose that against these funds are being used to keep a cross looking well when there are other things going on in that same community that seem to be somewhat falling apart. You know, Lawrence, when you take a look at this particular case, where now you've got to figure out where do I use government resources, and when it looks like it may be something that's actually quote unquote in support of World War I, but then a large part of the community looks at it as really a support of it just simply being a religious relic that actually exists in that particular part of town. You know, how do we juxtapose and get our own viewpoints to kind of get to the right point on this?
That's an excellent question. You know, a quick happy recap for our viewers, just a reminder that the Establishment Clause, as you know, essentially says that the government cannot set up a state religion, number one, and it also says that it cannot promote or inhibit religion. So it's really trying to keep it neutral and, you know, out of the flow of things. And this whole thing invokes the three-part lemon test. And spoiler alert, if lemon is in your name, something's probably going to suck. And true to form, the third part of this test is the one that generates all of the excitement and emotion, because the third part of the test says that the government should not foster excessive entanglement with religion. Now, if you have trouble figuring out entanglement, you are in good company. Entanglement has been such a baffling thing that it even got somebody slapped. But let me say this to you. This whole case talking about whether or not to remove this cross because it crosses the line into an area where the government is doing too much, so to speak, as it relates to religion area or something pertaining to religion. I believe it's a question that needs a good, clear answer, because right now, every time you look at how the Supremes have dealt with this issue, as Orlin pointed out earlier, you get this divergent response, and some of the responses don't even address particular issues. They more so talk about, you know, whether they're standing to bring it. So it's one of those things that folks seem more than happy to not just talk about. But it is an important issue because history has been used in the past to justify things that perhaps shouldn't have been justified. For example, Confederate monuments being all over the place. I don't care that they've been there 100 years. The issue is whether or not it's appropriate. And perhaps, before all of us are old and gray, the court will ultimately give some good clarification as to what excessive entanglement really is. And then we can move on to the next thing to worry about.
Well, you know, I think there's a couple of notes here. You know, it's important that the court lays out, you know, all of the procedural history for this type of case, because then we know what type of cases actually do have standing, whether they be in our interest or otherwise. And so it's important that they lay out all of those things before everyone. But I do think that, you know, that this is a really interesting point about, you know, the lack of clarity and expectations that we see from the court. And I think part of that is that, you know, many of us take for granted that there was a period of time where we expected, you know, the court to be relatively ideologically balanced. You know, folks will say that the court has no ideology. We all know that in practice, that's not actually true. And so we're seeing a moment that, you know, it tends to be relatively skewed depending on the side that you're on, while also trying to, you know, demonstrate some level of validity and balance in the courts, which we're not necessarily seeing here, not particularly in this case, but as we see as the broader ideological spectrum of the court. But I also think it's important, you know, circling back to this point about resources in the community, I think there is something to be said, especially when we look at, you know, communities that are disproportionately Black and Brown, which Bladensburg is. You know, these are communities that have other needs, like really and truly have other needs. They have other initiatives that they want to put, you know, funds to and what have you. And at the end of the day, a lot of this is just about budget. You know, and how do we get people the things that we need? We've spent time also talking in different forums about, you know, how the United States is very dependent on charity and religious organizations to do, you know, the community work that actually, given, you know, our social contract with the government should actually be willing to do. And so I think it definitely is reasonable for the citizens of Bladensburg to, you know, say, well, why are we pouring all these resources into a monument when we could be pouring it to other things that we need, like education, for public health services, and and, potentially, like COVID tests if you still need them, et cetera. So, definitely I can see where there could be some ambiguity given how long this, this statute has been here. And also some ambiguity given, maybe like the broader, religious ideologies of the folks at that time and what that means to them. But when it comes to allocation of resources, I think it's very reasonable for folks to, just query, why are we spending money here and not somewhere else?
Orlin, I want to jump back to Pastor Brown's comments as far as excessive entanglement as part of the Lemon test. And I absolutely agree. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? And that's why it's been so inconsistently applied by the court system. You have justices who favor separation of church and state, and they can use that test to find a violation of the Establishment Clause. But then you have supporters of accommodation who use the same test to uphold the practice or program in question. And, for this particular case, the Bladensburg Cross case, in fact, the court says we're just going to completely ignore the Lemon test that's usually used for Establishment Clause cases, and we're going to deal with historic relevancy or historic practices. And we've seen that happen more and more, to the end that the Supreme Court case that we had just last year, Kennedy v. Bremerton, which was dealing with the football coach praying on the football field of a public high school. Basically, the court that was the last straw, abandoned this Lemon test. And in fact, Gorsuch, whose opinion was joined by 5 other justices, and that's argued that the court had long abandoned the Lemon test because it was too abstract and ahistorical, and instead would be looking to emphasizing reference to historical practices and understanding. And I think that that's consistent with where the Supreme Court ended up in Bladensburg, as far as there was that historic understanding or practice that it pointed to.
Bettina, did the court get it right?
In my opinion, no. I mean, I resonated most strongly with Justice Ginsburg's dissent in the Bladensburg case, where she pointed out that there's this irony that in trying to keep that cross in place, the people arguing for that were actually distorting or watering down the religious significance of the object. They were saying, oh, it's historically important. It means different things beyond just simply being a Christian symbol. They were diluting its significance. I'm uncomfortable with that approach. And I think that is a danger wherever you start seeing government supporting religion starts becoming watered down. It starts to shift its beliefs in some instances to comply with whatever regulations are coming along with government support. So I don't think Bladensburg was rightly decided. I want to go back to what Melissa was just talking about, the Lemon case. For many years, the Lemon test has sort of been considered a zombie precedent because the Supreme Court has been avoiding applying it, but the lower courts were applying it in a haphazard way, and so the results were all over the map. And as Melissa rightly pointed out, in the Bremerton case last year, the Supreme Court finally put the precedent out of its misery and killed it off and said, no more Lemon test. And so they introduced this idea of historical practices and understanding of the Founding Fathers. Here's my problem with that. It is incredibly vague. And to me, it's basically an invitation to people to start sort of testing to see just how far the courts are going to go in dismantling the separation of church and state. So Bladensburg case, I think they got it wrong. And Bremerton case, I also think they got it wrong. I think that we are a long way off from finally settling this question of the appropriate relationship between church and state.
Nia, when we start to see this whole analysis taking place on how do you get to final conclusions, how do you take a look at what's going on from a legal perspective and you figure out how you juxtapose it against whether we're talking about a world war monument or talking about religious beliefs, and then it looks like they were tamping down the religious component and then wanting to bring it back up at the right time. It seems like people try to get their cake and eat it too when they start dealing with these topics.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about the historical standard. And mind you, I'm not a constitutional law scholar, so this is not my main area of expertise. But I think it's really important, calling to concerns that were made on all parts of this panel, that, a historical justification has also been used to uphold a number of different problematic things and ideas, right? Like ideas around segregation, which still, racial segregation, which ultimately has like very serious public health consequences to this day. I mean, this is one of the major reasons that we saw such major health disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Like leaning on history as the primary executor of these behaviors completely ignores that history has been used to harm. And so if we are going to lean into some of those standards, it probably requires the court to take on a holistic view of history and not one that just solely, holds up America in the best light, but one that actually takes in the all-encompassing view of everything that's happened in this country.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word on this, but this is gonna be something that we're gonna see happening for quite some time. How do you draw the difference between something that's religious, something that may be quote unquote monumental from a community perspective, and then making sure that people aren't simply trying to get their cake and eat it too and really utilizing both sides? Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Oh, this is gonna make me look like such a genius. Aaron Rodgers is going to be the quarterback of my favorite team. Mark it down, count it as done.
I don't see that. But Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So we've been talking about the Lemon test today. Well, Orlin, did you know that the lead plaintiff in that 1971 Supreme Court was a gentleman named Alton Lemon? He was a social worker and a civil rights advocate. He was additionally the first African-American head of the Philadelphia Ethical Society.
Wow. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So traditionally, the Democratic Party has generally considered their base to be all minorities, racial minorities in the United States. But we recently saw an upset in New York City that has shown that may not necessarily be the case. The Democrats managed to lose Sunset Park, which is a part of Chinatown in Brooklyn. Historically a Democratic stronghold. It is now flipped Republican. And so I think the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out what they're going to do about that.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, prepare yourself for this. Did you know that Australian football is not related in any way to American football or to soccer? It was actually based on Indigenous Australians playing a ball game way back in ancient times. And it was then created as a way to keep cricket players fit in between cricket seasons.
Clearly, I did not know that. So that's some great information. Listen, it was great having you guys on the show today and look forward to doing this again soon. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.